In a recent plenary session that drew scrutiny from international relations experts, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered a commentary on the United States presidential election that deviated from standard diplomatic protocols. While public attention often gravitates toward overt threats, analysts suggest the significance lies in the deliberate ambiguity of his stated preferences. According to reports, this messaging was delivered during an economic forum, a setting where leaders typically discuss trade rather than foreign domestic politics. This subtle shift in venue and tone has prompted Western observers to re-examine current assumptions regarding the Kremlin's communication strategy. Rather than a clear endorsement, the remarks appear designed to generate multiple interpretations, a tactic often found in Soviet-era doctrines of reflexive control. One procedural detail that appears minor but carries larger implications is the manner in which Russian state media outlets amplified the message. The coordinated dissemination suggests this was not an off-the-cuff remark, but a calculated signal. Political scientists and Kremlinologists have noted a stark contrast between these verbal statements and the concurrent activities of the Russian diplomatic apparatus. This discrepancy creates an institutional puzzle. Is the statement a genuine reflection of strategic calculation or a calculated attempt to sow confusion within the American electorate? Intelligence communities in the West have long monitored how foreign adversaries utilize public endorsements or the withholding of them to influence perception. Observers note that by publicly discussing U.S. election scenarios, Moscow may be engaging in a form of reverse psychology intended to complicate the standing of specific candidates. The unresolved question remains whether this is a tactical improvisation or part of a long-standing doctrine of geopolitical disruption. Within the United States, this rhetorical shift complicates the work of election security officials. When a foreign adversary's stated preference contradicts their suspected covert preferences, the narrative landscape becomes difficult to police without appearing partisan. Legal and intelligence frameworks established after 2016 are designed to counter disinformation, but they are less equipped to handle direct, albeit potentially ironic, diplomatic signals from heads of state. This raises a procedural question regarding how the State Department and the National Security Council officially categorize such statements as diplomatic noise or actionable interference. Furthermore, the timing of these comments coincides with critical debates regarding defense funding and foreign aid. By injecting himself into the domestic political conversation, the Russian leader effectively links the outcome of the U.S. election to the future of stability in Eastern Europe. Analysts emphasize that this creates a feedback loop where American foreign policy decisions are increasingly viewed through the lens of domestic partisan advantage, a dynamic that historically weakens diplomatic leverage. The challenge for strategists is to address the foreign commentary without inadvertently amplifying the adversary's message. Observers are now watching to see if this cryptic signal evolves into more concrete diplomatic maneuvers in the coming weeks. A deeper analysis of the language employed suggests the Kremlin may be utilizing a diplomatic tactic known as reflexive control. This method involves conveying information specifically designed to lead the counterpart to voluntarily make decisions that are advantageous to the initiator. By offering comments that are simultaneously vaguely complimentary and implicitly cautionary, Moscow forces Western policymakers and intelligence analysts to dedicate significant resources to decoding the true intent, rather than focusing on concrete actions on the ground. Diplomatic observers note that this ambiguity is not accidental. It serves as a low-cost leverage tool, allowing Russia to probe political reactions within the United States without committing to official policy shifts or concessions at the negotiating table. Historical context plays a pivotal role in understanding the weight of these statements. In previous U.S. election cycles, commentary from Russian leadership often focused on personality traits or compatibility in leadership styles. However, experts in U.S.-Russia relations point out that the current messaging appears to shift focus toward more transactional and pragmatic outcomes. This pivot suggests a strategic calculation that the future security architecture of Europe and the fate of economic sanctions outweigh personal rapport between leaders. Consequently, these signals are being scrutinized by institutions in Washington through the lens of potential shifts in geopolitical doctrine rather than merely as political favoritism. Another critical factor is the timing of these comments. which coincides with sensitive junctures in diplomatic clashes over nuclear arms control. With the New START treaty and military communication channels in a fragile state, any signal regarding leadership changes in the U.S. carries direct implications for global strategic stability. Analysts at the U.S. State Department are monitoring whether these statements are accompanied by any shifts in Russia's stance at the United Nations or within back-channel diplomatic avenues. The uncertainty lies in whether Moscow is positioning itself for a potential reset in relations or fortifying its stance for a prolonged period of isolation, regardless of who occupies the White House. The reaction within the U.S. political system to this signal also highlights the complexity of maintaining a unified foreign policy front during an election year. Statements from abroad often become subjects of domestic debate, forcing candidates to clarify their positions on international security commitments and foreign aid. This creates a procedural pressure on campaigns to balance domestic voter appeal with the need to send appropriate messages of deterrence or cooperation to foreign adversaries. As stakeholders parse the implications of this message, a key institutional question remains open. Observers are watching to see if this verbal intervention will force a substantive policy debate regarding the trajectory of U.S.-Russia relations, or if it will merely deepen polarization within the current political environment. As the latest statements from the Kremlin continue to generate ripples across diplomatic circles, the analytical focus has shifted toward decoding the specific linguistic nuances employed by President Vladimir Putin. International observers note that Putin's reference to a potential Donald Trump presidency is neither a straightforward endorsement nor a rejection, but rather a calculated assessment of strategic interests. Specifically, the use of terminology alluding to constructive dialogue is being compared against similar statements made during previous U.S. election cycles, raising the question of whether Moscow is genuinely seeking a policy shift or simply exploiting internal political divisions within the United States. A critical element in this phase is the distinct separation between Russian state media narratives and official Kremlin statements. While mass media outlets within Russia frequently broadcast messages that appear to favor disruption in Western politics, Putin's own language maintains a veneer of caution and adherence to traditional diplomatic protocols. This contrast creates an informational gray zone, forcing policymakers in Washington to discern between genuine signals and noise intended for propaganda purposes. Experts at the U.S. State Department are currently scrutinizing these comments to determine if they are accompanied by any preconditions for the normalization of bilateral relations, particularly regarding stalled nuclear arms control treaties. For European allies and the NATO bloc, the signal from Moscow is being received with heightened vigilance. The primary concern lies not with the individual candidate, but with the potential alteration of the transatlantic security architecture. Security analysts in Brussels are assessing whether Russia's signaled readiness to cooperate implies an expectation of reduced U.S. commitment to Ukraine. This places an intangible pressure on the unity of the Western alliance, as member states must prepare for divergent diplomatic scenarios depending on the U.S. election outcome. This uncertainty represents a variable that strategists term coercive ambiguity, where the mere possibility of a policy shift is utilized as psychological leverage. Furthermore, historical context plays an indispensable role in interpreting the current situation. Diplomatic historians point out that during the 2016 power transition, similar signals were broadcast, leading to expectations of a relationship reset, yet the reality that followed saw an increase in tensions and sanctions. Consequently, the current reaction from U.S. intelligence and diplomatic agencies is characterized by greater skepticism and caution. They are focused on identifying whether there is a long-term strategy behind these remarks, or if this is merely an immediate reaction to developments within the American campaign trail. The pivotal unresolved question at this juncture lies in the mechanism of implementation. If there is indeed a desire for negotiation from the Russian side based on the U.S. election results, which communication channels would be activated, and what red lines would be established. The absence of specific details regarding a diplomatic roadmap leaves current assessments in the realm of educated conjecture. Observers are watching closely to see if, in the coming weeks, there will be further concrete moves from the Russian Foreign Ministry to clarify the definition of cooperation they have referenced. The silence or subsequent steps from Moscow will be the most significant indicator determining the trajectory of U.S.-Russia relations for the coming decade. Delving deeper into recent statements from the Kremlin, international observers discern a complex communication strategy that transcends mere endorsement of any specific U.S. candidate. Political analysts suggest that President Vladimir Putin's comments describing President Biden as more predictable and old school may not reflect a genuine preference, but rather serve as a classic example of reflexive control. This is a Soviet-era doctrine aimed at conveying specially selected information to compel an opponent to make decisions favorable to Russia while believing those decisions to be their own. By publicly praising the stability of the current administration, Moscow may be seeking to complicate campaign narratives within the United States, where endorsement from a geopolitical rival is often viewed as a political liability. Simultaneously, the relative silence or ambiguous comments regarding former President Donald Trump create an information vacuum that forces Western policymakers to speculate. While Mr. Trump frequently references a positive past personal relationship with Mr. Putin, the Kremlin currently appears to be maintaining a cautious distance. Experts in U.S.-Russia relations point out that Mr. Trump's unpredictability, while potentially offering opportunities to disrupt NATO unity, also carries risks of sudden escalation or unannounced policy shifts, which a state apparatus that values stability, like Russia's, might fear. Thus, the signal from Moscow is not necessarily a choice between two individuals, but a calculation regarding which scenario would cause the most disruption to Western cohesion. Institutionally, U.S. intelligence and diplomatic agencies are closely monitoring how these statements are amplified across social media platforms and international news outlets. The primary concern for the intelligence community is not who Russia actually wants to win, but the potential for these narratives to erode public confidence in the integrity of the electoral process. Sowing doubt about the motives of both political parties in the U.S. serves the long-term strategic goal of weakening Washington's global standing, regardless of who occupies the White House next year. Furthermore, the context of the conflict in Ukraine plays a central role in decoding these signals. Any change in the U.S. administration has the potential to directly impact the flow of military and financial aid to Kyiv. Observers note that Moscow is preparing for both scenarios, an administration that continues a strong commitment to NATO or one with more isolationist tendencies. This preparation is evidenced by the strengthening of the domestic economy and the diversification of foreign relations toward the global South and East, minimizing reliance on political decisions from Washington. This raises the question of whether public statements about the U.S. election truly carry strategic weight or are merely a diversion to mask longer-term calculations regarding a multipolar world order. Ultimately, as the election cycle nears its decisive phase, the most significant open question for observers remains how U.S. voters and the political system will respond to this psychological statecraft. The maturity of democratic institutions will be tested by the ability to distinguish between noise and genuine security threats. Analysts warn that overreacting to or politicizing statements from the Kremlin could inadvertently grant Moscow the power to shape internal U.S. debates. National security officials are currently focused on bolstering election infrastructure and information transparency to counter any scenario.